So let's bring the experiences of the three different Dutch men or Dutch parties that ended up in Choson together and see what in their entirety they can be thought to mean. It's important to keep these things in mind, that there's a difference between the stories. So it's good to know the story of the first Dutchman in Choson, Jan Janse Weltevree, and his position with regard to foreign policy of the late Choson state and the relations with the Qing. To a certain extent, this also applies to Hendrik Hamel and his colleagues, and it would have been exactly the same had they not been banished because of their own actions to the southwest and then escaped, written a journal, and never been able to return. That's an important part. It's also the sad part, I guess, of the story, because it's quite clear what they must have left behind twice, first in the Netherlands and then in Choson. And finally, the much shorter chapter, in all kinds of ways, also in the time spent in Korea, because Fridolin Knobel never spent even 1 year in his entirety in Korea. The last chapter in this story, a Dutch diplomat's efforts in the late 19th, early 20th century to bring Korea within the orbit of Dutch commercial relations, and his failure to do so. What does this mean? Well, it's my reading is slightly different, I think, from what you often hear. Often Hendrik Hamel is seen as a symbol of the good relations between now South Korea and the Netherlands, and that's all great. But at the same time, I think it should be Jan Janse Weltevree who is that symbol of those good relations, because he is the one who went to Koryo, who went to Choson, and completely assimilated and became a Chosonite, if that's a word. This shows you, by the way, in the experiences of Hamel as well, and the people with him, that you could become a Chosonite, you could become a Choson Saram, which is not something we usually associate with this so-called closed-off isolated country. The Hermit Kingdom, it's sometimes called. I think that there are many reasons why we should reject this characterization of Choson, but this is one of the reasons, the concrete reasons, to do so. You could become a Chosonite. There are also some very universal reasons behind the acceptance of these foreigners, Weltevree, Hamel and the others, into Choson society, because they had something that the state needed. In this case, they could contribute to the military project, the militarization of society, the quality of the army, the quality of the cannon. But these skills were not just taken for granted, something else was given in return. A life, a career, a family, a place in society, a chance to lead a normal Choson life. And this is actually not as obvious or not as natural as it may seem. This is quite a thing. And it tells you something about Choson society at the same time. But Weltevree stayed there, and to my mind, he is the real symbol of good relations between the Netherlands and Korea. Hamel escaped, wrote his journal, wanted to return, and never could because of Dutch interests in Japan. And this is repeated, of course, in the experiences of Knobel. And because Hamel was not able to return to Korea, because Hamel was not able to convince the Dutch East Indies Company to establish relations with Choson, still Hamel is a trope in Korean speculative history. What if Choson in Holland had established relations through Hamel? What if it had not been Japan that had received the benefits of what in Japanese is called Rangaku, Nanhak, Dutch studies, but if Choson had received those benefits, if Choson had modernized and industrialized instead of or earlier than Japan? I don't have the answer to that question, but the fact that these questions are still being asked are interesting. And I think it should be connected to Fridolin Knobel's experiences in the late 19th century as well. Because the decisions made by mainly the Japanese and the Dutch governments, to a certain extent also the Choson governments, were the same as the decisions they'd made 200 years earlier, even if the situation had changed radically. This is very superficial, to put it this way, because the context has changed. But at the same time, I see a fundamental similarity between the approach of Hamel and Knobel to Choson. They both, to differing degrees, because Hamel really knew what he was talking about much better than Knobel, and he spoke Korean and Knobel didn't. But they tried to leverage their positions as foreigners with knowledge of Choson to change its position in the international world, to be of benefit both to Choson and to the Netherlands, and both, unfortunately, failed. The Netherlands wasn't ready. The relationship with Japan was seen as too volatile or too dangerous to upset. The Japanese presence in the Dutch Indies was seen as potentially subversive, so all kinds of reasons not to talk to Korea seriously. But this does tell me that Knobel's experiences as a foreigner in Choson were very much similar in the end, or at least in terms of results, as Hamel's experiences. And the person who is really different here is the only really successful foreigner in Choson that we know about, Jan Janson Weltevree, who had chosen to accept Choson as much as Choson had chosen, difficult to pronounce it this way, to accept him. He became Pakyon, he stayed, he learned the language, he took the military state exams, he raised a family, and he never looked back. Now, what this makes clear to me is that both in the 17th and 19th century it is quite clear that Choson was not the hermit kingdom it's often made out to be. It didn't respond necessarily positively to proposals from foreign powers, but it did not refuse to deal with them. It made its own choices. Choson in the 17th century seems also, and this is important I think, to have been remarkably open to foreign men of particularly needed talents, to the extent that Hamel and his crew could become Choson citizens and were claimed as such when after they had fled to Japan. And I guess the most important sign or piece of evidence for me that the notion of the hermit kingdom is really a colonialist, outdated notion that really doesn't apply to Choson is the fate of Jan Janson Weltevree. He will not have been the only one who assimilated into Choson society. And the fact that he was able to be there and to be treated well and to be given a chance to lead a normal life makes it extremely problematic to talk about Choson as a hermit kingdom, or in more neutral language as an isolated country. I don't think Choson was. So I think, and this is my conclusion, we should make a very sharp analytical distinction between different ways of being a foreigner in Choson. On the one hand you have Hamel and Knobel, and Hamel started out like Weltevree, but in the end ended up like Knobel. So they left and they tried to change Choson from the outside. Weltevree successfully assimilated and stayed. And it's ironic perhaps, but Hamel's huge international success, and especially in the 17th century, everybody seems to have known his journal, and still in certain parts of the world it's well known. His huge international success, his lasting fame, was not founded on his success, but on his failure, and I guess also on his refusal to unconditionally assimilate. And that's, I think, a distinction without any kind of moral or ethical judgment that needs to be made between the different ways of being a foreigner in Choson, Korea, by way of the Dutch.